So I want to look at our reading this morning solely as parable. Now, it's most likely a parable of preparedness, which is the invitation to be ready for what God has in store for you. But definitely, I want you to read verses 36 through 30 through 43 sometime later today. These verses provide an allegorical explanation or interpretation, and there's a lot of debate among scholarship as to whether the explanation originally went with the story or not. And one of the reasons of the dispute is that allegory limits the understanding of the parable to a narrow interpretation. And there's nothing wrong with allegorical interpretation, but to read something as allegory is just different than listening to the story as a parable. Now, and here's why I think that matters. If you already know the answer to something, if the explanation has already been presented to you, there is nothing new for you to learn. You already know what you know. So when one reads as allegory, it's not as parable, and it becomes simply as a reminder. So don't hear me wrong. Being reminded of something, important information, taking a refresher course, has value because it builds up long-term memory and it keeps everybody kind of on the same page. But still, when you read things as allegory, doesn't lead for you to learn and discover. It helps you remember. So later today, read the parable again, then read the explanation in verses 36 through 43, and then take what you hear from me during the sermon and place those all together and let your intellect and imagination have some time together and let the passage work in you. I want to suggest that parables are profound and mysterious, always pointing us toward the values, attitudes, the perceptions, and the orientation of God's way, or toward what God is like, or what the kingdom of heaven is like. Parables are puzzling and meant for deep reflection. And I believe that if we allow the parable to wash over us, if we allow the parable to sit in our hearts and our heads, we are better positioned to have a moment of wisdom and insight, to have a moment of epiphany or revelation of theological truths that will lead us to a greater sense of faithfulness. I think it's just simply worth our effort. Someone wrote, the parable of the wheat and weeds is a prime example of a text that can provide surprising and interesting conversation if we do not assume too much at first about what it says, or too quickly imagine we understand what it says about us. The parable tells us that the weed and the wheat look the same, that they grow together. And it's hard to tell the difference between the two until they mature. The weed is called Lolium temulentum, or what is known commonly as darnel. Darnel is a weed that has no redeeming purpose. Its function is actually to harm. Now, its roots takes the water and the nutrients from the good plants. It takes it from them and harms them. It's virtually impossible to dig up the darnel. And so the workers in the parable are correct. They want to get rid of the weed. Their job is to save the crop, to harvest. But the farmer tells them, no, leave the weeds alone until the time of the harvest, and then you'll be able to tell them apart. So the plan is for the farmers to tell the workers at harvest to separate the two, putting the wheat safely into the barn while throwing the weeds into the fire to be destroyed. And they listened and did as the farmer instructed, and the disciples listened to what Jesus told them. Now, this notion of scattering of good and bad seed and the product of wheat and weeds sat hard in me this week. And it's a bit deeper than thinking of wheat as of something being valued, worthy, and weeds being something as unworthy and worthless. Now, true, it's a whole lot easier for me to think that way. You know, the either or proposition, limiting myself to only those two possibilities as presented in the parable. Either someone is like the wheat, or someone is like the weed, valued or unworthy. Now, I don't deny that there's wheat and weed in the world, that there are good people and there are bad people. I don't deny that good is present and bad is, and evil is also present. And I know that the bad prosper alongside the good, and that's just part of life. It may be unfair, but wheat and weeds grow alongside. They live next to each other. And that's the paradox we live. I also get that people are not always what they appear. Some people might seem really good in reality, but are not so good. And other people may seem like they are bad, but not that bad at all. I get judging too quickly is not wise. But as I worked my way into the parable, trying to stay consistent with the either or, am I valued and worthy like wheat, or am I unworthy like weed? It seems too simplistic and, more importantly, disengaging. But if I had to answer the question, am I like wheat or am I like a weed? The question that, if I had to answer it, should not surprise anyone when you hear me say that I am wheat. I am like wheat, and I believe that's how God sees and knows me. And there is not 1 ounce of me that does not believe that I am valued and worthy in God's eyes. And without any reservation or any hesitation, I say the same thing about you, everyone who has gathered for worship this morning. There is no doubt in my mind. Each one of you is valued. That's how God sees and knows you, and I believe our lives are distinguished. Now, where I stumble is when I'm not being so weedish. And I know that's not a word. But when I'm not being so faithful, and when there is more darnel growing in me than goodness in me, both good and bad exist around me and in me, but I listen, I learn, and I live as one who has value in God's eyes. And because I'm wheat and I mess up, weeds grow. And I don't always do, as the Apostle Paul once wrote, the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. Now, I'm not going to bore you with my list of bad behavior, poor decisions, faults, and failures. It's not a short list, but neither is it a long one. I am not perfect. And thankfully, you don't expect me to be perfect, but perfection is not my goal. My goal is achieving greater faithfulness. That's what I strive for. And sometimes when I miss the mark, sometimes we all miss the mark, and that reveals the darnel in us much more than it does the fruit of the Spirit in us. So as a person of faith, sometimes behaving badly is more visible in the choices I make than living Christ-like. And in those hybrid times, perhaps it's not so much about my behavior, maybe it's more about my attitude toward others, casual indifference or intentional disdain or unlearned dislike or cultural distrust. Attitudes can be just as harmful and grow within us, causing sinfulness weed in our lives. And so what about you? What about you and your attitudes toward you know who? You know who I'm talking about that's in your life, in your community, in your office or on the screen. What about your attitude toward them? How do we produce things that make for faithfulness when sometimes our attitude nourishes the darnel? Oh, how I wish faithful living was less complicated. But faithful living is relational living, and that's what makes faithfulness more difficult and challenging. But let's go back to the parable and perhaps do what Jesus asks. What if we collected the weeds, all the negativity, the negative influences, the negative impact, all the stuff that causes our faithfulness to be challenged. And what if we just bind them all together and get rid of them? Not so much make it about the darnel and others, but let's make it about the weeds that we nurture and nourish in our lives. See, I think the parable invites us to gather up the unfaithful stuff and get rid of it. I don't think we should focus too much on others. What's your darnel look like? And how have you been nourishing the harmful and unfaithful influences in your life? Can we just get rid of it? And the answer is yes. And yes, we can get rid of their hold on us today, tomorrow, and every day forward. We can make it a habit of letting go of sinfulness. As people of faith, we do not foster harm or hurt in action or in attitude. We are people of faith called to be fruitful, to bundle up the goodness of God in you, and to continue to live each and every day faithfully.